September 15, 1950. The Yellow Sea, 12 miles off the coast of Inchon, Korea. Admiral Arthur Struble stood on the bridge of the USS Mount McKinley and watched the horizon through binoculars as the first light of dawn revealed what his staff had spent 3 months telling him was impossible. 230 ships stretched across the Yellow Sea in every direction, the largest amphibious operation since the Normandy landing 6 years earlier. Destroyers, cruisers, attack transports, landing ships, minesweepers, hospital ships, and the carriers whose aircraft were already in the air providing cover for an operation that virtually every military mind in Washington had opposed, questioned, or flatly declared suicidal. 12 miles away, behind the sea walls of Inchon Harbor, North Korean forces were waking up to discover that the war they thought they were winning had just changed completely. They had been told by their commanders that an American landing at Inchon was impossible. The tides that swept through Flying Fish Channel made navigation hazardous for large vessels. The mudflats that surrounded the harbor extended for miles at low tide, turning the approaches to the sea walls into an impassable wasteland of grey mud that would trap any landing craft attempting to cross them. The sea walls themselves rose 15 feet above the harbor, requiring assault troops to climb ladders under fire. The channel approach was so narrow and so easily defended that a handful of artillery pieces properly positioned could destroy an entire fleet attempting to force passage. Every one of these obstacles was real. Every one of the concerns that Struble's staff and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Army and Marine planners and the Navy admirals had raised was legitimate. The tide windows at Inchon were so narrow that the entire assault force had approximately 2 hours on the morning of September 15th to get ashore before the tide went out and stranded every landing craft on the mudflats until evening. There would be no second chance. Either the assault succeeded in 2 hours or it failed completely and catastrophically. General Douglas MacArthur had listened to every objection, considered every concern, and ordered the landing at Inchon anyway. The story of Inchon begins 3 months earlier, in the catastrophic days of late June and July 1950, when the North Korean People's Army had crossed the 38th parallel in overwhelming force and driven the Republic of Korea's army and its American advisors into a desperate perimeter around the port city of Busan in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. The speed and ferocity of the North Korean advance had shocked American commanders who had not expected a conventional military assault of this scale and capability. By August 1950, the situation around Busan was critical. 8 American divisions and their Korean allies were defending a perimeter approximately 140 miles long and 50 miles wide against North Korean forces that outnumbered them significantly and were pushing toward the sea with the confidence of an army that believed final victory was within reach. The men defending the Busan perimeter were fighting with the desperate intensity of soldiers who understood that if the perimeter collapsed there was nowhere to retreat to except the ocean. MacArthur understood something about the strategic situation that many of his subordinates and most of Washington had not fully grasped. The North Korean army attacking Busan had extended its supply lines down the length of the Korean peninsula, stretching them thinner with every mile of advance. Those supply lines ran through Seoul, the South Korean capital, which sat at the narrow waist of the peninsula near the west coast. Cut those supply lines at Seoul and the North Korean army attacking Busan would be simultaneously cut off from its supplies and threatened from the rear. The force that had seemed unstoppable would be trapped between 2 American forces and destroyed. The landing at Inchon, the port that served Seoul, was MacArthur's solution. It was elegant in its strategic concept and terrifying in its tactical execution requirements. MacArthur had been thinking about it since the first weeks of the war. The opposition from his own staff and from Washington was intense and, on its face, completely reasonable. General J. Lawton Collins, the Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Forrest Sherman, the Chief of Naval Operations, flew to Tokyo in August to argue against the operation in person. Their list of objections was comprehensive and specific. The tidal range at Inchon was among the largest in the world, varying by as much as 32 feet between high and low tide. The mudflats exposed at low tide extended for miles in every direction from the harbor, making any landing attempt outside the narrow high tide windows impossible. The channel approach, Flying Fish Channel, was so narrow that ships would have to navigate in single file, presenting an ideal target for shore-based artillery and mines. Intelligence indicated that the North Koreans had defensive positions on the small island of Wolmi-do that commanded the harbor entrance and would have to be neutralized before any landing could be attempted. And the seawalls surrounding the harbor meant that assault troops would have to scale 15-foot vertical obstacles under fire rather than wading ashore on an open beach. MacArthur listened to all of it. Then he stood up and talked for 45 minutes without notes. His argument was strategic and psychological simultaneously. He acknowledged every tactical difficulty his critics had raised. He agreed that Inchon was technically the most challenging amphibious operation ever attempted. And then he turned those objections into the foundation of his argument for proceeding. The very factors that made Inchon seem impossible were the reasons the North Koreans would not be prepared for it. An enemy that has been told a landing is impossible does not prepare for it with the same thoroughness as an enemy that knows the landing is coming. The surprise that Inchon's difficulties would generate was itself a tactical advantage of the first order. He invoked historical precedent with the authority of a man who had been studying military history for 50 years. Wolfe at Quebec had scaled cliffs that the French considered unclimbable and taken the city that commanded the St. Lawrence River. The British had been told that crossing the Delaware in winter was impossible, and Washington had used that assumption to achieve one of the war's most decisive victories. Every great turning movement in military history had been executed precisely because it was attempted where the enemy least expected it. He concluded with a statement that the officers in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. "We shall land at Inchon, and I shall crush them." Collins and Sherman flew back to Washington. The Joint Chiefs approved the operation. The preparation for what was designated Operation Chromite had to be accomplished in weeks, rather than the months that conventional military planning assumed for operations of this scale and complexity. The 1st Marine Division, which would conduct the assault, had been scattered across the Pacific and the United States and had to be assembled, equipped, and transported to Korean waters in time for the September 15th tide window that was the last acceptable date before winter conditions made the operation impossible. The Marines who were pulled from posts across the Pacific and the United States for the Inchon assault were a mixed force of regulars, reservists who had been recalled to active duty with days of notice, and veterans of the Second World War who had returned to civilian life and found themselves back in uniform for a war that nobody had predicted. Many of them had not been in a combat unit for 5 years. Their equipment was a mixture of new and surplus. Their training time before the assault was measured in days and weeks rather than the months that doctrine specified. What they had that no training program and no amount of time could have provided was the knowledge, deeply embedded in Marine Corps culture and in the specific memory of the men who had fought from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, of what amphibious assault actually required. The Marine Corps had spent 20 years between the wars developing the doctrine of amphibious warfare from first principles, and the men of the 1st Marine Division carried that doctrine not as text in a manual but as instinct developed through the most demanding school available, having done it before under fire. The final planning for Chromite identified 3 distinct landing sites within Inchon Harbour, each presenting its own specific challenges. Green Beach, on the island of Wolmi-do that commanded the harbour entrance, had to be taken in the morning tide on September 15th before the main assault could proceed. Blue Beach and Red Beach, on the Inchon mainland, would be assaulted in the evening tide, after the mudflats had been covered again by the returning water. This meant that the Marines who landed on Wolmi-do in the morning would be isolated on the island for approximately 11 hours while the tide went out and returned, within sight of the Korean mainland but separated from reinforcement by miles of exposed mudflat. If the North Koreans counterattacked in force during those 11 hours, the Marines on Wolmi-do would have to hold with what they had brought ashore in the first wave. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Taplett, commanding the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines who would assault Wolmi-do, was aware of this. His planning for the morning assault reflected the Marine Corps conviction that speed and violence of action were the answer to tactical problems that caution could not solve. His men would hit the beach moving fast, push inland immediately, and take the island before the North Korean defenders could organize an effective response. The Navy's preparation for the assault included a preliminary bombardment designed to suppress the defensive positions that intelligence had identified on Wolmi-do and along the Inchon sea walls. Destroyers entered Flying Fish Channel on September 13th to conduct close-range bombardment, deliberately drawing fire from North Korean shore batteries to identify their positions. The destroyer USS Collett took 17 hits from North Korean shore guns during the bombardment mission. Her crew continued the mission. The night of September 14th, the assault force moved into position. Landing craft were loaded. Marines checked their equipment for the last time. The tide calculations that had driven the entire planning process were verified again by Navy navigators who understood that a 15-minute error in timing could strand the assault force on the mudflats. At 6:33 a.m. on September 15th, the first wave of Marines from the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines crossed the line of departure and headed for Green Beach on Wolmi-do. Naval gunfire and aircraft from the carriers had suppressed the North Korean positions. The landing craft hit the beach. What happened in the next 22 minutes would define the entire operation. Taplett's Marines moved off the beach with the controlled aggression that the situation demanded, pushing inland through the smoke and confusion of the preliminary bombardment, taking the high ground that dominated the island before the North Korean garrison could fully organize its defense. Small unit leaders made decisions in seconds that doctrine would have required minutes to process. Marines who had been reservists 6 weeks earlier performed with the precision of veterans because they were being led by veterans and because the Marine Corps culture that surrounded them demanded nothing less. By 6:55 a.m., 22 minutes after the first wave landed, the American flag was flying from the highest point on Wolmi-do. The island that had been described as a potential killing ground for the assault force had fallen in less than half an hour. MacArthur, watching from the bridge of the Mount McKinley, reportedly turned to his staff and said simply, "The Navy and Marines have never let me down." The 11 hours between the morning landing on Wolmi-do and the evening assault on the Inchon mainland were among the most tense of the operation. The Marines on Wolmi-do consolidated their position, treated their wounded, and waited while the tide went out around them and the mudflats that separated them from the mainland were exposed. North Korean forces on the mainland could see them clearly. Artillery and mortar fire fell on the island intermittently throughout the day, killing and wounding Marines who had no option but to stay in their positions and endure it. The North Korean command in Seoul was sending frantic messages to Pyongyang. The landing that was supposed to be impossible had happened. The island that was supposed to protect the harbor had fallen in less than 30 minutes. Reinforcements were needed. Orders were contradictory. The shock of the unexpected had disrupted the command and control system that the North Korean army needed to respond effectively. This was exactly what MacArthur had predicted. An enemy that had not prepared for an attack because it believed the attack was impossible had no prepared response when the impossible arrived. The North Korean forces in the Inchon area were capable soldiers who had demonstrated their effectiveness throughout the summer campaign in the south. But they had not been positioned, equipped, or mentally prepared for what was happening to them on September 15th. And the hours while the tide was out were hours in which the initiative belonged completely to the Americans. At 5:30 p.m., as the tide returned and began covering the mudflats that had separated Wolmi-do from the mainland, the main assault force began its final approach to Red Beach and Blue Beach. The landing craft that had been circling in the Yellow Sea since morning formed into assault waves and headed for the Inchon sea walls. The moment of truth for Operation Chromite arrived at approximately 5:31 p.m. when the first landing craft hit the Inchon sea walls and Marines threw their scaling ladders against the 15-foot vertical concrete barriers and began climbing under fire. There is no way to adequately describe what it means to climb a ladder under fire. The Marine who is climbing has both hands occupied with the ladder. He cannot shoot back. He cannot take cover. He can only climb as fast as possible and hope that the suppressing fire from his comrades below and from the naval gunfire overhead is keeping the defenders' heads down. If it is not keeping their heads down, he will be shot off the ladder and fall back into the landing craft or into the harbor. The Marines climbed anyway. They climbed because they had been trained to climb and because the men below them were depending on them to get over the wall and because that is what United States Marines do when they are told to take a position and there is only one way to reach it. The sea walls fell. Marines poured over them into the streets of Inchon and began the fight through the city that would continue through the night and into the following day. The North Korean garrison fought back with the determination of soldiers who understood what the loss of Inchon meant for the entire campaign in Korea. But they were fighting a force that had momentum, surprise, and the particular aggressive energy of troops who have accomplished something they were told was impossible and know it. By the morning of September 16th, Inchon was secured. The Marines had suffered 196 casualties in the assault, including 22 killed. The North Korean garrison had been effectively destroyed or dispersed. The harbor was open and American supplies and reinforcements were already beginning to flow ashore. The advance on Seoul began immediately. MacArthur's plan called for the capture of the South Korean capital to be completed by September 25th, exactly 3 months after the North Koreans had captured it in the opening days of the war. The symbolism was deliberate. MacArthur understood that wars were fought for political objectives as well as military ones, and the recapture of Seoul on a specific symbolic date would announce to both the Korean people and the watching world that the initiative in the Korean War had shifted permanently. The fight for Seoul was brutal in the way that urban combat is always brutal. Close-range fighting through streets and buildings against defenders who knew the city and were motivated by the knowledge that they were fighting for the capital of their country. The Marines and Army soldiers who fought through Seoul in the last week of September 1950 paid for every block in casualties that were painful even against the backdrop of the stunning strategic success that the Inchon landing had achieved. Meanwhile, south of Seoul, the effect of the Inchon landing on the North Korean forces besieging Busan was exactly what MacArthur had predicted. The supply lines that had sustained the North Korean offensive through the summer were cut. The army that had been on the verge of pushing the last American and South Korean forces into the sea suddenly found itself fighting on two fronts with no supply line connecting it to the north. Units that had been attacking began receiving orders to retreat, orders that in many cases arrived too late as American and South Korean forces broke out of the Pusan perimeter and drove north to link up with the forces coming south from Inchon. The North Korean People's Army, which had been a formidable and disciplined military force through the summer of 1950, disintegrated with a speed that shocked even MacArthur's most optimistic staff officers. Entire divisions ceased to exist as organized units. Soldiers who had been fighting effectively 2 weeks earlier were surrendering in groups of hundreds, separated from their units, out of ammunition, cut off from any source of supply. The army that had driven from the Yalu River to within miles of Pusan in 3 months ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force in approximately 2 weeks. By September 29th, MacArthur stood in the restored National Assembly building in Seoul and formally returned the South Korean capital to President Syngman Rhee. The ceremony was choreographed for maximum political effect, and MacArthur was a man who understood political effect as thoroughly as he understood military operations. The Lord's Prayer was recited. The South Korean and American flags were raised. MacArthur spoke of the liberation of a people from the tyranny that had oppressed them. It was one of the most complete and rapid reversals of military fortune in the history of modern warfare. 3 months earlier, the North Korean army had been advancing toward total victory. On September 29th, that army had effectively ceased to exist and the South Korean capital was restored to its government. The military analysis of what MacArthur had accomplished at Inchon began immediately and has continued ever since, because Inchon is one of those operations that reveals, in concentrated form, both the heights that military genius can reach and the conditions that are necessary for that genius to be translated into action. The intelligence work that preceded Chromite was extraordinary in its detail and its accuracy. Lieutenant Eugene Clark, a Navy officer, had been landed secretly on islands near Inchon 2 weeks before the assault to conduct first-hand reconnaissance of the tides, the mudflats, the sea walls, and the North Korean defensive positions. Clark had lived on those islands for 2 weeks, communicating by radio with the planning staff in Tokyo, providing the specific measurements and observations that planners needed to make final decisions about landing sites and timing. On the night of September 14th, the night before the assault, Clark had turned on a lighthouse on one of the islands to guide the assault fleet through Flying Fish Channel. He had done this alone, on an island surrounded by North Korean-controlled waters, because the fleet needed that light and he was the man in position to provide it. Clark's contribution was representative of the quality of preparation that the entire Inchon operation required and received. The operation that critics had called impossible was accomplished not through recklessness or luck, but through meticulous planning that accounted for every obstacle and developed specific solutions to each one. The tide windows were calculated to the minute. The preliminary bombardment was timed to the second. The scaling ladders were the right height for the seawalls because Lieutenant Clark had measured those seawalls 2 weeks earlier and radioed the measurements to Tokyo. MacArthur was not, as his critics sometimes suggested, a general who succeeded through audacity alone. He was a general who combined audacity with preparation so thorough that the audacious thing became achievable. The combination was rare and dangerous in the hands of a man whose confidence in his own judgment was as absolute as MacArthur's, because it created in him a certainty that what he believed was right, a certainty that would lead him into the catastrophic miscalculations of the following months as Chinese forces entered the war and destroyed the army that Inchon had seemed to make invincible. But in September 1950, on the sea walls of Inchon and in the streets of Seoul, MacArthur's combination of strategic vision and meticulous preparation produced something that military history does not produce often. A perfect operation. An operation where the plan worked, where the timing held, where the enemy was as unprepared as the planners had predicted, where the troops performed with the skill and courage that the plan required, and where the strategic result was exactly what the operational design had intended. The North Korean army that had been advancing toward total victory in August was destroyed in September. The war that had been going badly was transformed into a war that seemed won. The landing that every expert had called impossible had succeeded so completely that its success seemed, in retrospect, inevitable. It was not inevitable. It required 230 ships positioned with precision in the Yellow Sea. It required tide calculations that left no margin for error. It required Marines who could climb seawalls under fire because they were United States Marines, and that was what the situation required. It required a Navy destroyer crew that continued its bombardment mission after taking 17 hits because the mission was not complete. It required a lone Navy lieutenant on an island in enemy-controlled waters who turned on a lighthouse at midnight because the fleet needed the light. It required, above everything else, one general who looked at a list of reasons why something could not be done and saw in that list the reasons why it should be done. General Matthew Ridgway, who would replace MacArthur in Korea the following year and who had his own complicated relationship with MacArthur's legacy, wrote about Inchon in his memoirs with the particular clarity of a professional soldier assessing another professional soldier's work. Whatever his faults, Ridgway wrote, and they were many, MacArthur at Inchon achieved something that I have never seen matched in my experience of military operations. He looked at what everyone agreed was impossible, understood why everyone agreed it was impossible, and then used those impossibilities as the foundation of a plan that worked precisely because the enemy had also concluded it was impossible. There are perhaps a dozen operations in military history that deserve to be called brilliant. Inchon is one of them. The Marines who climbed the sea walls at Red Beach and Blue Beach on the evening of September 15, 1950 did not know they were participating in a brilliant operation. They knew they were climbing ladders under fire because somebody had to go first, and it was their turn to be first. They knew the men below them needed them to get over that wall and clear the way for the rest of the assault. They got over the wall. They cleared the way. They did what United States Marines do when they are told that something is impossible and ordered to do it anyway. On September 15, 1950, the impossible took about 2 hours. The tide helped, once. Then it went out. Then it came back. And when it came back, the Marines were ready. They were always ready. That is what Inchon means. That is what MacArthur understood about the men he commanded that his critics in Washington did not fully appreciate. Given a plan that accounted for the obstacles, given the equipment and the preparation and the fire support and the timing, United States Marines and soldiers would do what was required. They would climb the impossible wall. They would take the impossible position. They would turn the impossible operation into the operation that changed the war. MacArthur knew this because he had watched American soldiers and Marines do impossible things for 50 years. At Inchon, he gave them the most impossible thing he could find. They did it in 2 hours and 22 minutes. The war in Korea would continue for 3 more years, through the catastrophe of the Chinese intervention and the grinding stalemate of the ceasefire negotiations and the final armistice in July 1953 that left the peninsula divided roughly where it had been before the war started. The stunning victory of Inchon would be followed by the disaster of the Chosin Reservoir and the painful years of fighting along lines that barely moved. But on September 15, 1950, for 1 morning and 1 evening divided by 11 hours of waiting while the tide went out and came back, the United States military accomplished something that military experts had declared physically impossible. And the men who did it were exactly what American soldiers and Marines have always been when the country needed them to be their best. They were ready. They were trained. They were led. And they were American. That was enough.